Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time to talk a bit more about Star Wars. Let's jump right into it. It is the long-awaited review and analysis of Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. There's so much to talk about with this particular movie. You could really spend hours on it. I'm going to try to limit it to the important details for evaluating the movie in total and giving a general impression of what's going on with this particular work of art. A little bit of background on my relationship with this movie. It came out in 2005, and back when I saw it in 2005 in theaters, it was actually my least favorite of the prequel movies. But since seeing it in theaters and watching it multiple times after that, it's actually become my favorite of the set, and hopefully you'll know why by the end of this presentation, because it does a lot of things that are kind of unexpected and actually wouldn't be done under the normal set of Hollywood rules for making a movie. Let's start with aesthetics. Aesthetics are what I usually start with. I'm primarily talking about visual design. Visual design apart from how it is executed with special effects. I view these as two separate things. The aesthetics of this movie are certainly extremely impressive. One of the things that really strikes me about this movie is the continuation of aesthetics from the previous prequels into the original trilogy. You have this kind of crossover. So the Republic warships that you see in the very first scene, they look like the Star Destroyers, the Imperial Star Destroyers that you were going to see in A New Hope in the original Star Wars 1977. So they draw that parallel, but all of the Republic stuff has color painted on it throughout the movie. And when you finally see it kind of turn into the Imperial stuff at the end, it has the color stripped off of it. So you have a really strong connection there. You have Jedi fighter ships, which look like TIE fighters, but with a slightly different design, a little bit elongated. You can see how the visual design is going to transition into what we're familiar with the original trilogy, with TIE fighters, X-Wings. You see lots of references to these original trilogy aesthetics. And in a sense, it's like a visual passing of the torch. And I'm really impressed that they were able to pull this off and keep everything looking unique. You even have the clone troopers. They look like stormtroopers, but they have the color painted on them, and you can see that they're going to become Imperial stormtroopers when we see there. And you also have characters visually framed in a way that's going to allude to them in the original trilogy. You always have Palpatine sitting in a chair the way that the Emperor would. You even have the scene at the beginning where Palpatine is sitting in the throne of Grievous's ship, handcuffed there, and Obi-Wan and Anakin arrive to save him from Count Dooku, and it's visually really similar to the Death Star bridge, if you will, in Return of the Jedi. And I believe that was completely intentional by George Lucas. Everything was framed in a way to have a relationship with the original trilogy, but also specifically a relationship with Return of the Jedi. And I'll get to that towards the end of this presentation. There's a huge number of biomes presented, lots of different planets that you get to see. You get to see jungles and beaches and volcanoes exploding. There's a massive amount of visual variety. It's almost overwhelming, but that's kind of been the case throughout the prequel trilogy, with a little bit of an exception with Episode 2, which has a little bit limited kind of view there. So there's Coruscant in this one. There's Kashyyyk. There's lots of different planets for you to see. Just a real visual feast in terms of variety. And alluding to the way that the aesthetics kind of cross over, you have this elimination of a diverse and democratic-looking republic and being replaced by the sameness of the Empire that's primarily human. There's not a lot of aliens in the Empire. All the stormtroopers look the same, and they're all human. So you have diverse Jedi that are wiped out by faceless human clones. You have this fight that happens towards the end of the movie in an empty Senate hall, signifying that the democratic part of the Republic has been completely wiped out. It's been torn away, and what's left is the Emperor and the lone survivor of the Republic, if you will, the lone champion of Yoda, and he doesn't really stand a chance. He's essentially already lost, and he knows it. But he has to put up a fight, because that's what honor kind of compels him to do. And at the end of the movie, you have these Republic ships finally have their color wiped away, and they're just empty gray triangles, just like what we see in the original trilogy. It's quite a interesting way of visually expressing some of the themes in this particular movie, which is about the destruction of the Republic and the gaining of an empire, a bit of an echo of, say, Roman history, if you will. And in general, I think this is the best visual design of any Star Wars movie, and probably possibly the best visual design of any movie ever made. So I give this a 10 out of 10 in the aesthetic scale. All the prequels are really excellent in terms of the way that they present their visual design, the variety, the intensity, the baroqueness, but episode 3 really takes the cake. It's definitely one of the best ever. It's really hard for me to give a 10 out of 10 score to anything because it's hard to say that something is perfect. But rating this in terms of flaws, it's almost impossible. It's such an overwhelming and baroque artistic experience. I really can't give it anything besides a 10. It really is just something else. And here's some stills for you to look at. Here's the thing about looking at stills. You have to see this movie move with it. So, up here in the corner, you have this scene of Sidious, of Palpatine, they don't know he's Sidious yet, sitting on a throne in a bridge that looks a lot like the end of Return of the Jedi, with a battle going on outside of the windows. You have some views of Kashyyyk and Yoda and the holograms. There's just all these little beautiful moments, but seeing them in motion is really what you ought to do, because the camera work supports the really amplified scale of this. Just to look at Palpatine sitting on the throne, there's a panning that happens with the camera that shows you the top and the bottom and the ceiling, and focuses in on the characters in a whole bunch of different ways. So you get to see, you can't see it in a still frame. A still frame doesn't capture what's going on in this movie very well at all. This is just there so that you could get an idea of how intense the aesthetic and the visual design actually is. Let's talk about cinematography and visual effects. This is the way that the movie shot. Generally, the cinematography is really excellent, and the visual effects are also really excellent. And this goes for whether you're going to rate this in 2018 terms or you're going to rate it in 2005 terms. In terms of 2005, it's pretty insane. And in the fact that it holds up in 2018, it really says something about how well they were able to technically achieve this particular film. It really is a great achievement. So there's a lot of visual space used by David Tattersall, and it's the biggest of any Star Wars movie, meaning you're seeing the most on screen. Usually action movies are shot pretty close to actors because we like to see the actor's face. In this case, it's an even wider set of shots than what we got in the original trilogy and other prequel movies, to show just how baroque the aesthetics really are. They employed a kind of a unique editing approach where George Lucas would finish shooting a scene and it would immediately go to the editors of Roger Barton and Ben Burt, and they would edit everything together. And each time they got a new scene, they'd go back and edit everything together. So as everything was being shot, it was being edited. So while they were making the movie, they have an edited visual presentation of what they've done so far in the story. They have an idea of how the pacing works already. It's a very unique approach. Usually you shoot everything and you're not really editing as you shoot. You shoot everything as you plan, and then you go back and edit and spend all that time trying to get it tight. In this case, they were editing as they went, which allowed them to adjust what they were doing in the production schedule based on how they'd accomplish things with the shots ahead of time. And I think it actually makes the movie flow in an interesting way that most movies don't. Most movies tend to have here's a collection of scenes feel. This movie really kind of flows from one scene into the next pretty well. There is some incongruity, and I'm putting this in the production, and I could put it in story, but it's presented as part of the editing. There's a time lapse difference. So there's this big chunk in the movie, kind of in the second to third act, the transition to the third act, and I'll explain how the acts work in this particular movie when I get to this story section. But this incongruity happens when there's a whole bunch of time with Anakin and Palpatine developing what's going to happen on Coruscant, while Obi-Wan is fighting a battle that would have taken, maybe a matter of hours. So you have a really short amount of time that's being cut in between these longer, more dramatic presentations that would probably be happening over days or weeks or something like that. And this battle that Obi-Wan is preparing for against Grievous that would take a day. And I'm keenly aware of that difference in time. This isn't the first Star Wars movie that did it. When I get to the original trilogy, this happened in those as well, but in this one I was particularly aware of it, and this added to this feeling that Anakin's seduction to the dark side happens quicker than I think it actually does. And I think if the movie had been edited slightly differently in terms of cutting in and out of those scenes, and I understand why they edited it that way, because you have a big climactic act closure in the battle against Grievous, and you need that to line up with what's happening with this fight with Darth Sidious and Mace Windu and his other Jedi, like Kit Fisto, who dies in unceremonious death at the hands of Darth Sidious. So those things have to line up in terms of the narrative, which means you have to dilate some time somewhere. But it was still, I got to knock at a point for that, even though for the most part the editing within the scenes is really well done. Generally, there's a lot of excellent compositing going on. The CG models tend to blend in really well with the stuff that isn't CG. The droids finally look like they fit in the environments, much more so than the previous movies. The live action, the practical effects, the sets, they all blend together. There's a perception that the prequels were shot entirely on green screen, the way kind of a lot of modern Marvel movies are. That's not the case if you go look at a lot of the production. Like one of the scenes that I showed with Palpatine kind of on this throne in this battleship, the set is there. They did use computer generated graphics for the battle outside, but they did that kind of compositing in the original trilogy too. In this case, you just have an ability to have a more detailed fight happening outside the window, and it works pretty well. So generally the scenes are not very present. There's a couple of visual scenes, and most of it's due to really clear framing and really bright lighting of scenes that contain all these different elements, and that tends to just allow the eye to find any kind of imperfection. The human brain's a great difference engine, and so the more information you give it, the quicker it is able to determine differences between things and where things don't fit together. So you notice a lot of modern movies, they tend to keep it pretty dark when they're going to be doing a lot of compositing. They don't keep it super bright and clear because you can tell the difference between those. The human brain's very good at that. So most of the scenes that occur in this movie, like in the other prequel movies, happen when the scene's very brightly lit. And I still think George Lucas wanted brightly lit scenes in a lot of places in all of these movies because that was what he imagined. And if the compositing wasn't perfect, then it was still aesthetically what he really wanted. So you kind of have to, I don't know, maybe give it a little bit of slack if there's if there's an obvious difference between something that was done on the computer and something that was done completely live. Overall, I give the cinematography, visual effects a 9 out of 10, and that's pretty much by today's standards. When I watched this movie on Blu-ray pretty recently, I was really struck about how much better it looked than a lot of movies I've seen recently. It just, 10, 13 years have passed, and the technology should have gotten so much better, and yet somehow the presentation of this movie ends up being so much more convincing and more interesting throughout. So definitely liked it. Score. So we're talking about score and sound design. This is the sound elements. John Williams does this score. I actually think it's the best score since the original movie, and I might say it is the best Star Wars score. And that's a hard one to say, but it does things so well and does things that really could only happen in this movie that's bridging a gap between the prequels and the original trilogy. My favorite score might be Return of the Jedi because it just has some fantastic elements, dramatic elements. But this one is, if it's not superior to that one, it's a very close runner-up. And one of the things that he does a bunch of original things. This is one of the most original Star Wars scores you'll hear. And in fact, when I compare this score to Force Awakens or The Last Jedi, it's amazing to me how much more creative I thought John Williams was with his everything he threw into this. One of the things he does thematically, he uses a lot of themes and uses them in a lot of traditionally operatic ways, a lot like what you'd hear in something by Wagner or Strauss. In this one, you have this Imperial March theme that's presented as a heroic theme for Anakin Skywalker that slowly transitions into this dark and more familiar theme, and he does it through some modulations and some slight changes in rhythm, and also changing the accompaniment, the time, the feel of it, and the instrumentation. So you have that familiar theme, you hear it, you know what it is, but it's being presented in this glorious way rather than this dark and sinister way. And it really matches Anakin's transition from this real heroic figure at the beginning of the movie to a figure of somebody who's fallen and given in and been turned into something evil. So that's one of the best uses, but there's all kinds of stuff like that. There's also a lot of non-traditional harmony. There's a lot of extended techniques. He has like bowed percussion. He uses what I assume is a digital reverb to create some very strange effects amid the orchestral score. He doesn't just stick to regular orchestration, and that enhances this movie, which is a pretty dark movie. I really did enjoy those elements of the score, especially in the context of the movie. Although I don't know if I would like hearing them as much if I just listened to it on their own. I tend to look at it, how does it fit with the movie? And this one probably does the best job of any of the scores for how it fits with the movie. So, and then he uses the final scenes. They have a visual and a musical return to the original trilogy with this Force, what they call the Force theme, which is this theme that's played on a horn usually. You play it on a horn because a horn is a reflected sound. If you're playing a French horn, the horn part of it where the sound comes out is actually pointed backwards, and so it's reflecting off the back wall of the orchestra, which gives it a distant and kind of melancholy as well as a slightly nostalgic effect. And so the use of that in the original movie, and then getting to hear it return in the final scene of this movie, it was such a good like drawing of threads between what was and what is. So it was definitely very good. I give it a 10 out of 10 score, and I hesitate to give a 10 out of 10 score, but there just weren't any moments throughout the score that I thought were at all subpar. Everything was used efficiently and used well. Really was a great presentation. Sound design, I think you guys know what I'm going to say with the sound design. This sound design is excellent. It's got that classic Star Wars punch. It's got great framing of sounds. Everything that you need to hear is heard, which is not the case in a lot of modern movies. George Lucas shot the movie knowing how the sounds would line up and whether they would cover up dialogue, which is great. It allows you to have these really loud, powerful sound effects. There's some new sounds for the droid army, which are interesting. There's a lot of new things you haven't heard in Star Wars, which kind of pop out and enhance the overall sound design of what you're hearing. And the environmental impact of the sound is really big, especially in the final duels. The explosions, the sirens, the echoing inside of the Senate chamber, all of those things really have a big impact on the emotional state of those fights. And so overall, 10 out of 10 sound design. It's really hard to find any flaws in what they did with the sound. It's just really top notch. And obviously, it's best to hear the sound on a system that can really give it to you the way it was meant to be heard in 5.1. But if you're listening to this in stereo, if you're watching this movie in stereo, the stereo mix on the Blu-ray is amazing. It's actually a really good stereo mix, and it's really rare that home video mixes end up having as good a sound design as what you find on the Star Wars Blu-ray. It's great. So 10 out of 10 sound design. Let's move on. Before we move on, let's sum up production. I think this is actually one of the best produced movies of all time, which is saying something. Like it's on par with anything that's ever been done, and it still holds up in the way that very few movies do. Lord of the Rings holds up years and years after its production, and that's one of the best produced movies of all time as well. So, and it holds its ground with modern production and surpasses them in a lot of ways, just like Lord of the Rings does. So you have to give it up to the incredibleness of the production. They really knocked it out of the park with this. I also think this is probably the closest to George Lucas's vision for the look and feel of Star Wars, and in terms of what it is as a production. You have these massive battles. The battles are bigger and more baroque than anything you've seen before, bigger than anything in the original trilogy, bigger than anything in the other 2 prequel movies. You have lightsaber duels that are really dramatic, not just well choreographed the way the lightsaber battle was in, say, Phantom Menace, but well choreographed, highly dramatic, fueled by the supernatural. The force is at play in all of these. It's not just dudes with light swords. The environment is in play at all times. That's something that George Lucas puts in his lightsaber duels that you don't see in the sequel trilogy, by the way, is that there's environmental hazards. He did it in pretty much every lightsaber duel after the very first movie. They're fighting in an environment that's hazardous, and he really overdoes it. Like volcanoes that explode and Senate chambers with discs flying around. It's really something to see. So I think it's definitely what George Lucas would have wanted in terms of what Star Wars is as a visual and just a production focused movie. So 9.75 out of 10 for the production. It is one of the best produced movies of all time, in my opinion. It still really holds up. Let's talk about the characters. There's 2 general parts of the story that I'm going to evaluate: the characters and the plot. I'm going to leave the setting out of this in terms of a numerical value. The setting, it really is important for the setting to watch this particular movie, but because Star Wars is such an expansive thing, it's not really fair to give it like a world building score or something like that. There's world building that happens, there's explanations for lore that happens, but that happens in all of the movies, and they all kind of fit together in that particular way. Because it's not on its own, I'm just going to skip any kind of evaluation of the setting. So generally the characters are good, but the execution fails primarily in the dialogue. So the big problem with dialogue is that the dialogue is really direct. Characters say how they feel, or they say what the audience kind of needs to know for the story, and it comes off as sometimes cringy, sometimes like just kind of off and doesn't feel quite right. That's the big problem with the characters, is the execution of the dialogue feels off in a lot of scenes. And at the same time, I don't know how they could have carried some of the scenes without the obvious dialogue. It's kind of hard to avoid some of that direct dialogue when you're dealing with a movie that's as baroque as this, and with drama that's as kind of intense as what Star Wars tends to promote. And that's also been the case in past Star Wars movies, including the original trilogy. There's a lot of direct dialogue, people saying how they feel or how they intend to act, or what needs to happen. Not as bad as it is in the sequel trilogy, where they're like, we got to blow this thing up. It's like, thank you. You wouldn't have said this before going on the mission. Anyway, let me move on. Hayden Christensen, he's a lot better in this one than episode 2. He does come off as a more troubled and heroic character as well. And the conflict, I think, is carried a lot better by him. He looks more the part in this particular movie. And so overall, I think his performance was okay. Definitely a lot better than how I felt about him in episode 2. The death of the villains, this is partly a pacing thing, but the death of the villains feels a little anticlimactic. And the reason it's anticlimactic is because we are introduced to Grievous at the beginning of this movie, and then we kill him off before the end. We haven't really gotten to know Grievous or view him as a threat. If you watched the animated series, especially the first one, the cartoon, Grievous is a major threat and is an extremely frightening character to think about. And so Obi-Wan being able to defeat him is a big deal. But just looking at the movies, we didn't see him in the previous movie. He hadn't been introduced. We didn't have any kind of investment in Grievous dying. Likewise, Dooku, we don't really get to know Dooku very well. He's an ominous character that beats the heroes at the end of episode 2, and then he dies at the beginning of episode 3. And because we didn't see him in the kind of interquel animated series, it just feels a little anticlimactic. It's a big miss. I know that this might be a plot thing or an execution thing, but we don't care about those characters enough to view their deaths as something significant and meaningful for the protagonists. Ewan McGregor does sell a lot of subpar story explaining dialogue. He's a good actor. The dialogue is not as good. If you stop and you were to look at it on paper, it would probably look worse than it sounds coming out of his mouth. And I think, the some of the awkward dialogue that exists in the original trilogy, because you had someone like Harrison Ford saying it, it just doesn't feel as awkward. He just carries the character and carries the dialogue so much better than if you have any kind of actor that isn't able to have those enough screen charisma to pull off bad dialogue. So any kind of dialogue that's not very good tends to be pretty obvious in this particular movie. Samuel L. Jackson, to me, delivered. It's a kind of uneven performance, but it's good for what it is, because Mace Windu is very brooding in this particular movie. He has a lot of darkness to him. He's worried about something, and if you see Mace Windu in, again, these integral animated series, you can see that he becomes increasingly dark throughout the course of the story, that the dark side is increasingly depressing him, that the war makes him into somewhat of an he tends to have not a lot of sympathy for his enemies. And so because of that, it really sets up the final scene with Mace Windu pretty well. And there's a lot of uneven dialogue, the way it's written, but I actually think Samuel L. Jackson, when I see him in Revenge of the Sith, I'm like, he is a good choice for Mace Windu, because Samuel L. Jackson is able to have that. He has a particular kind of screen charisma of this dark and brooding and kind of powerful character, and it works in this movie in a way that I don't think it worked, especially in episode 1. In episode 1, he felt like he was in the wrong character. In episode 3, it really felt like, to me, that Samuel L. Jackson was like, it was the correct actor to play that particular character. Ian McDiarmid, who does Palpatine and does the Emperor, they're all the same character. He's really good, and this movie, you really get to see him doing two different personalities at once: the politician, and then of course the Dark Lord. And you can see him kind of get turned into the Emperor in a particular scene, and he does a great job with it and really bridges the gap between those. And it's interesting that he was able to play the same character 30 years later that's younger than the character we see in the original trilogy in Return of the Jedi, but it has to do with, he played that character in his 30s, and they did a lot of makeup to him, and he's only gotten to be a little bit better actor with age, so he does a great job with that. And he has a lot of direct dialogue as well, and he doesn't carry it quite as well as you would hope, but overall his acting job was good. Yoda, again, feels slightly awkward, and that's because he does have a meaningful kind of character arc that is about downfall, and that works for him, and it's very interesting to see Yoda in that place. But the way he talks, that was established all those years ago, tends to make him a slightly awkward character, just to hear dialogue come out of him and just to see him act with other characters. He always feels a little off as a Paragon Master, rather than the weird Paragon Master of Empire Strikes Back, this strange guy that lives in a swamp that's more than he appears. But overall, it works. So the Fall of Anakin, I feel like it was rushed, and part of that is because of that editing that I talked about. And if you bring in, the Clone Wars series, it doesn't feel as rushed, because you can see that starting to develop. You can see his heroic side coming out, but it feels a little bit rushed in this movie, primarily because of the way that they did the editing, and also because it just tends to happen. There's a tipping point, and then he just becomes Darth Vader, rather than him slowly transitioning, getting seduced, and then acting a lot as Darth Vader. And my expectation when I saw this movie in 2005 was that the turning to the dark side would happen rather quickly, and the movie would be about Darth Vader, slowly becoming this cyborg and hunting down the Jedi. And that's not what happened. He was turned quickly into Darth Vader, and I think that was meaningful for George Lucas, is that once he ceased to be Anakin, he really did become Darth Vader, and was quickly turned into the cyborg that we know as Darth Vader. There's some competition between his motivations, not in a bad way necessarily. So there's saving Padme, which is his wife, and the Jedi being power-hungry hypocrites. Both are set up and both end up working. And they both come together at the same point, where Mace Windu is going to kill what appears to be a defenseless Palpatine, thus working against the Jedi Code, sacrificing his means to the end of stopping the Sith. And at that moment, Anakin, you can see in his face that that's what changes his mind, and then he believes the lies of the Emperor, that the Jedi are these power-hungry fools and they're just like the Sith. And seeing that they're just like the Sith, he makes a decision. I'm just going to be a Sith because they can actually, they can actually get some stuff done. His power gain also seems to happen with very little input from Palpatine. Palpatine's like, you're dark side now, and he's like, I'm powerful. And we needed some scenes where he could somehow exercise that, or we know what that means, rather than him just giving into the dark side and as a moral thing. So there's some stuff missing there that I felt like is a little bit necessary for me to fully believe Anakin's transition to being this Dark Lord. And I've mentioned this before, dialogue in a lot of places is just too direct and feels awkward. So, from my perspective, it is the Jedi who are evil. Yeah, it's just saying it so directly. It's like it feels awkward and weird, even though that's exactly what he probably would need to say to explain himself. It just feels a little off. It's not very poetic. It doesn't flow. It doesn't sound like the way somebody would talk. Probably just like, no, you're the evil ones. It's you that wanted to overthrow the Republic. Rather than saying, from my perspective, it is the Jedi who are evil. So I feel like a lot of this movie, if you had rewritten the dialogue or like dubbed different dialogue, you'd probably have a higher opinion of the story in general. Only I have the power to save the one you love. That's Palpatine's about to die, and he just tells Anakin that to get him to come over. It just feels a little awkward, feels a little off. It's too direct. So overall, I felt like the characters were 7 out of 10. That's average. They do get pulled off in most cases, and the awkward dialogue is what keeps it from being a higher score. Let's go into plot. Plot for me is primarily the event sequence of the movie. So the first thing about the plot that you should know is that this plot does not adhere to the standard Hollywood 3-act plot structure. At least not in the way that you would think it does. So it has its own interesting flow due to the way it was edited together, just in terms of the way it feels. But the way the story is paced, it's a 3-act movie that then has an extra act where everything gets destroyed. So you have this first act, which is save Palpatine. You go on this ship, you save him. Anakin kills Dooku, and thus that begins the conflict for, is he going to turn to the dark side? Second act, you have, let's track down Grievous, let's spy on Palpatine, because the Jedi are now suspecting that something weird is going on with him, and he might be wanting to seize power and not give it back. And the third act is defeat the Separatists, destroy the Evil Lord. This is where Obi-Wan has his deal with Grievous. They have the big fight, and Obi-Wan succeeds. He kills Grievous. So that should be the end of the movie. And Mace Windu confronts Darth Sidious. He confronts Palpatine. Palpatine reveals himself as the Dark Lord. He does this amazing 960 out of a chair. Like, 3 Jedi get killed when he jumps out of his chair, but to be fair, I don't think most people would expect some old man to like fly out with a lightsaber and wreck everyone. But Mace Windu succeeds. Mace Windu beats Darth Sidious, and Anakin comes in at the end. And that's where you have this extra fourth act that happens, where Anakin, seeing that Mace Windu wants to kill Sidious, intervenes. Mace Windu gets thrown out the window and presumably dies. And then the fourth act happens where all the protagonists lose. All of the plot goals then become failures after they should become successes. So you should have the success. We won the Clone Wars. We defeated Grievous. We caught the Separatists. We've won the Clone Wars. And this fourth act is the Clone Wars were just there to give power to Sidious so that he could create the Empire. You helped him achieve his goal. And the fourth one is now it's too far along for you to stop it. And all of the protagonists lose, including Anakin. Anakin loses his soul. Obi-Wan loses his friend. Yoda loses all the Jedi, loses the Republic. Everybody fails except for Darth Sidious. And that's a really interesting format for a movie when you think about it. And that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about this movie, and I don't think you would normally... This is a movie that shouldn't exist in this particular format. You would never be able to get this pushed through and funded and shot and put out there. George Lucas had to do this movie on his own because it wasn't going to get made. Certainly not in the 2000s with the 90-minute Hollywood machine that just kind of churned out 3-act movies over and over again, and they still do that. So chances are a major studio would never put out a movie like this because that 4th act feels so weird and because it's so different. The whole movie has a different approach to plot than most movies do, and I actually think that's a strength upon further viewings. It felt off when I watched it the first time in theaters because I'm so used to that standard movie plot, and this one did the standard movie plot and then gave you an extra act where everybody loses. It's very interesting. If you want to think about it, I'll talk about this with the ring cycle. The movie ends when Mace Windu wins, and then there's an act that really sets the stage for the next trilogy, and it's like its own little mini act, its own little mini movie. I mentioned the cross time. That's a problem with the plot. You can look at it as a problem with editing, a problem with the plot, but it's there, and it's a pretty obvious error. The fall of the antagonist early on in the movie, it does help set up the expectations that the movie's going to end in a certain way. I think that helps that 4th act to really feel like it's coming out of nowhere, really feel like a surprise. Even though we know that Anakin is going to become Darth Vader, just the surprise in the structure of the movie kind of ends up working as a surprise, even though this should be the most predictable. This should be the most predictable Star Wars movie of them all because it's Episode 3 coming before Episode 4, but in actuality, it's the least predictable Star Wars movie. And that final act really gets set up well when you stop and think about it. So the death of Dooku does set up this conflict where Windu wants to kill Palpatine, and Anakin is turning to the dark side. Anakin is able to see the Jedi and the Sith as the same. He killed Dooku, and so he's acting like a Sith, and he sees that the Sith have more power, and that moment with Mace Windu, that's an important plot moment. Really kind of sets up everything for how Darth Vader was going to end up being turned to the dark side. And there's an interesting plot point too, where Anakin saves Obi-Wan after he defeats Count Dooku, thus signaling to the audience, kind of a save the cat moment, that he's still good. So even though he killed Dooku in cold blood, he saved Obi-Wan because there's still goodness in him, and that's really, really important for the feeling of the character when we approach the original trilogy, that there's still goodness in him. He still cares about things, and we even have him caring about things in the very final scene as well. So overall, I think the plot was an 8 out of 10. The big flaw, of course, being the execution with, you know, the time differences in the second act. But I like the way that it goes into that 4th act. To me, that was a really interesting thing. So some other thoughts with the story. This story does feel like an actual closure of the cycle. Things really do close off more than they just open up for the original trilogy. It feels like a dark ending. There's a big cringe moment when Darth Vader says, "No." I don't know if other people feel the way I feel about it, but I saw it in theaters. I was like, ugh. It just felt so wrong. There was just something kind of ugly about it, about him emoting like that. Because Darth Vader, once we have the mask of Darth Vader on, we don't see Darth Vader as this emotional child anymore. He becomes like a robot. He becomes like a death machine. So it just didn't fit really well at all. But it was an important scene because he asks what happens to his wife, which indicates he was still thinking as a good person on some level. This film is actually packed with a bunch of symbolism. There's Sidious and Yoda battling in an empty city. I talked about that. During that battle, Yoda loses his lightsaber, and that's symbolic. He loses his lightsaber. He can't continue the duel, and he never gets another lightsaber again. His days as a warrior have ended, and all he can do is leave and try to train the next ones. He even meets up before then with Obi-Wan, like, we'll leave a message at the temple for any other Jedi that to stay away, and that this is essentially, it's like the end, and he knows it's the end of it. Obi-Wan is fighting Anakin for his soul. He's trying to stop him from being an evil Darth Lord. in a literal hell, an exploding volcano of fire. If that's not symbolism, I don't know what is. It's kind of right up in your face that the turn of the dark side ends up happening in a literal hell. You have this idea that goes through all the Star Wars movies, that the real enemy is power, not necessarily a clear antagonist. Although Sidious is the antagonist, what draws Vader in is the power to save his wife. What draws him in is the power to defend the Republic. The danger was power. The temptation was power. And being able to abstain from that danger is really kind of the role of the Jedi. And that's how the original trilogy was solved, is that Luke essentially refuses power. He refuses the Ring of Power, and it ends up being Vader who kills Sidious. It's a great closing of that next cycle. You have Anakin and Dooku. Anakin kills Dooku by crossing the blue and the red lightsabers and cutting his head off. This is highly symbolic because it's a crossing of the threshold. You have the red Sith lightsaber, you have his blue Jedi lightsaber, and they're both cutting his head off, meaning he's kind of from that point forward, he's two people. He's Darth Vader and he's Anakin, and Anakin finally dies once we get to the end of the third act, and he stops Mace Windu and helps kill Mace Windu and becomes Vader and submits to the dark side. And then, of course, you have this ending symbolism of the two sons and two children. It's a whole drawing together of the cycle. Some story tie-ins with the original trilogy in the EU. All of the masters by the end of this are old and beaten. So Obi-Wan and Yoda are old, beaten men in the original trilogy. Only Obi-Wan kind of still has a lightsaber. Yeah, and he gives himself up to allow Luke to escape, who he knows is like the real hope. You also have Sidious, who's been deformed by the Force. You have a crippled Darth Vader, who's a cyborg, and that kind of explains why all the lightsaber fights are so much tamer in the original trilogy. They're so much simpler compared to the insane flashiness of the prequel trilogy. Everybody who knew the Force has been crippled by it by the time this cycle comes to an end. There's a hint that more Jedi are out there when they send that message out there, because there's a lot of kind of hidden Jedi that are out there in the EU. So that's maybe a little nod to that. That there's a possibility there could be more people out there. They leave it a little bit open, and they give you a reason why Vader wouldn't really search for his children. Sidious just tells him, "Hey, you killed your wife, and therefore you probably killed the babies that were inside of her." And of course, Sidious, even if she had lived, he wouldn't want to tell Vader that, because that is a thread of goodness. That's the first thing he asks about. And because he's able to sever that thing that Vader cares about, he's able to get Vader completely under his control. There's nothing left of the original passion that drew him to the dark side. Then he's just a robotic evil force. So overall, story 7.5 out of 10. Pretty good. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the ring cycle. This is something I've talked about in my other prequel videos. Basic idea of the ring cycle is that the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy are inversions of each other. The prequel trilogy starts with brightness and goes towards darkness thematically. The original trilogy starts with darkness and goes towards brightness. And in this case, episode 3 concludes with utter darkness, episode 4 begins with brightness, and because of this inversion, the movies line up in opposite order from each other. Episode 4, the original Star Wars 77, lines up here with episode 3, and that makes sense, I think, from George Lucas's production standpoint, is that he was concluding Star Wars with episode 3. They line up pretty well together. They line up together thematically, and in this case, they're an inversion of the go to darkness and then come out of darkness to light. You have a closing of the cycle in episode 3, and during that closing of the cycle, on the darkest point in the entire story, the collapse of the Republic, the destruction of the Republic, the replacing of the Republic with the Empire. On that day, Luke the Messiah is born. And this, of course, has mythological origins. We celebrate Christmas on the solstice, or very near the winter solstice, for very good reasons, because on the darkest day, the Messiah is born. That which brings the light begins in darkness. So on that day, Luke is born, also Leia is born, and they, together end up being the saviors of the Republic, of the galaxy, and the overthrowers of the Empire. You have an opening battle that ends in victory rather than defeat. So in this case, the Republic succeeds in their opening battle. In Star Wars 77, the Rebellion loses. But in both cases, the Rebellion loses. So the Resistance loses and the Rebellion loses. But the good guys are on opposite sides from each other, which is a little bit interesting, a little bit weird. But you have the exact same outcome, if you will. You have the good guys actually succeeding in retrieving what was lost, which in this case was Palpatine. In Star Wars 77, it was the Death Star plans. But the good guys are on different sides for this one. The bad guys are on the run rather than the good guys, right? And so they find and defeat them. Rather than the Empire tracking down the Rebellion, which is the case in Star Wars 77, you have the Republic tracking down the Separatists. But in both cases, you have the big bad triangle ships tracking down and destroying what is a rebellion. Just the good guys are on opposite sides. It's a very interesting way of lining it up when you stop and look at it. You have an older Paragon kind of midway through the movie fight a Dark Lord. So in episode 3, it's Mace Windu. Mace Windu fights Palpatine, desires to kill him rather than stay true to his Jedi code, and that results in his downfall. Versus Obi-Wan fights Darth Vader, refuses to kill him once again, has no, refuses any kind of objective to do so, and that helps Luke, the actual Messiah, to escape, and gives ultimate victory to the story. And so it's this point where when Mace Windu failed and became willing to kill someone in cold blood, all the protagonists ended up failing. The good guys ended up failing as a result. In this one, because Obi-Wan didn't do that, because he refused to kill Vader even at that point, the good guys ended up succeeding. So there's an interesting inversion of those two outcomes. One outcome resulted in failure and darkness. The other one resulted in success and light. You have this waning of Yoda. He symbolically loses his lightsaber. Luke symbolically receives his father's weapon. That's kind of, again, this crossing of times, this passing of the torch, if you will. And you have the film, of course, visually ending showing stripping out the colors. It shows the Empire, shows the Death Star being built, which of course is the main objective, the plot objective of Episode 4. And the film ends with the dual sunrise or dual sunset, depending on the way you're looking at it. So if you look at it as a sunrise, that's the sun rising for the beginning of the next cycle. And when Luke is watching the sun setting, he's looking off into the horizon, wishing for something more than what he had. So it's an interesting symbol of the cycle, is those two suns for two children. Let's talk about the general effect. Now, we've talked about the ring cycle. It's a very interesting thing, and I think George Lucas, 6 movies, he ended it the way he began it in a way, and I think that has a certain poetry to it. So general effect, this is one of the best produced films of all time. I think it has the strongest plot of the prequels in the way it's executed and its result with the least wasted time of any of them. The direct dialogue is a distraction, and that's kind of a negative for me. But it still has a lot more of those meaningful Star Wars moments than the other prequels. And I think that's why a lot of people have such nostalgic attachment to the original trilogy. It was very, very good at delivering these isolated moments that really tugged at you and you really remembered, and had some powerful piece of information or some saying of wisdom that you remembered, like when Yoda says, "Do or do not, there is no try," or when Yoda lifts the ship out of the swamp and sets it down, and Luke says, "I don't believe it," and he says, "That is why you fail." Or any of these moments. I think Empire Strikes Back has had so many of them, and that's why people love that movie. But Return of the Jedi had a whole bunch of them. Pay the price for your lack of vision. Your overconfidence is your weakness, and your faith in your friends is yours. These moments that really carry forward in time. There was a lot more of these in Revenge of the Sith. There was a lot of those little moments that, if at least visually happened and really had a big impact and had some emotion behind them. This was my least favorite in the theaters, but it's my favorite after theaters because my expectations. I thought there was going to be a whole movie of Darth Vader being essentially an evil badass, and that's not what I got. I got this secret fourth act thing, this weird fourth act thing where he turns suddenly into Darth Vader and then gets converted into the cyborg rather quickly. But it was this overwhelming audiovisual experience, and for that reason alone, people ought to watch it, just for the production alone. Overall, I give it an 8.5 out of 10. That's my Journal Effects score. So the overall score is 8.6 out of 10. That's a solid, good movie. I think this is definitely a worthy Star Wars movie. It's one that everyone should see, if for nothing else than the production. But it does tell a very interesting story, and it tells it in a way that's very not typical for Hollywood movies, and that's also worth paying attention to as well. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see or hear in the future. I'm happy to deliver it, even if it takes me a long time, like these Star Wars videos have, in order to get to all the relevant details. Don't forget you can join my mailing list at dvspress.com/list, and you'll have upcoming access to my books. If you found value for this, feel free to drop me $1 on Patreon, patreon.com/DavidVStewart. Follow me on Twitter, David V. Stewart. Visit my websites, dvspress.com, davidvstewart.com, and I do appreciate it always. I do read the messages, I do read the comments, even if I don't respond to all of them. I get kind of overwhelmed with the amount of attention you guys give me, so I'm sorry if I can't always return it within the best time frame. I really, really do appreciate the discussions, though, so I'll see you all next time. Have a great one.